So with that, we're going to dive into psychological and psychiatric issues from climate heating. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robinder Bhangoo, Medical Director, Adolescent Intensive Outpatient Program, Cornell Behavioral Health Pavilion from our own Sarasota Memorial Hospital. Please welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to do things a little bit different because I know you've been here for a day and a half of talks or a day of talks, but I found this topic very interesting. I want to see about the slides. Let's see. Okay. So keep an open mind. I'm going to be playing something for you that is actually a modern day depiction of some of the earliest known works of literature. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was a story from ancient Mesopotamia about Sumerian mythology written about 2100 BCE. And it tells a story about Gilgamesh, who was the king of Uruk. They found tablets in the ancient ruins. Can you hear me okay? Numerous tablets, and one of the tablets depicted the story of an epic flood. So the flood came out because one of the gods was angry at humanity or felt like the earth was overpopulated. There's some controversy on that, but basically planned to have an epic flood to wipe out humanity. One of the gods, God E, warned a man named Utnapishtim and said, these floods are coming, build a boat, fill it with craftsmen, fill it with all the animals you can find, and go set sail. He set sail for 6 days, 7 nights, as it rained and rained, and after the 7th night, the rain stopped, and he landed on Mount Nimush. Sounds familiar, right? But it was written hundreds of years before the story of Noah. Now, if you look, cultures around the globe had flood myths, as far east as China, India. In India, it was a fish that warned a fisherman. And they had stories of the Algonquin tribes, Hopi tribes, and indigenous people in North America, all talking a similar theme about a warning of a flood, building of a boat, 6 days, 7 night type of thing, and finally landing on a mountain. It tells us like its earliest depiction of man's effect by the climate. This was a terrifying disaster, similar to what we feel like we've gone through. And when watching the stories about Helene in North Carolina, people were saying biblical, epic. And this is kind of why it stirs the psyche and the soul of humans, is because your whole entire existence can be devastated by the environment. So depictions of the flood went on throughout society. If you look at ancient mythology, there were many gods in all the different cultures which had to do with weather. The Vikings, they prayed to Thor. Thor's smashing of his hammer created the sound of thunder. The sparks from the hammer crashing was the lightning. And sailors would pray to Thor for a safe passage. Tlaloc was an Aztec god of rain and agriculture. So the Aztecs would pray for a good harvest. This talks about maybe what the motivation of early man was, is safety from big disasters, hurricanes, floods, but also sustenance, agriculture, food, safe passage, sailing. My family and I went to Turkey last year, and we visited Hagia Sophia, which is a mosque now, but started off like a church. And the guide showed us in one of the back pedestals at the bottom of the column was a carving of Poseidon. So he said, they're building a church, but they thought it can't hurt to pray to Poseidon to protect it. So It's human nature. And there, as Rick was saying, education. They did not understand what created these disasters, what would bring on the rains, what wouldn't. So they relied on the gods. As time passed, man started understanding a bit more about climate, weather. As man developed, technology developed, there was more of a dissociation between weather and even agriculture in terms of, we're relying on artificial means of watering plants. And maybe that created some of the problem that we're in right now too, because that detection, with that advancement, people stopped caring so much about the weather. Now, modern time, this is a big joke that everyone wakes up and they say, Siri, what's the weather outside? As opposed to just looking outside or going outside. But now we are at this point where we're recognizing that there is a lot of effect on the climate from our man's actions, and there is distress, as Rick mentioned. There are reactions to the climate, which I'm going to talk about now. First, I'm going to do this in a little different sections. So what Rick mentioned, eco-anxiety, ecological grief, solastalgia, which basically means distress about the climate changes and the inability to control it. These are what, some literature, they say normal reaction. I don't use that because I think even if you have a clinical condition, it's pretty normal too, but I would say non-pathological. So these are not clinical conditions that I, as a psychiatrist, would treat, but they're things that happen. So I'm going to spend more of my time talking about the more clinical, because that's probably what you're interested in, knowing what my experience is. So this is the copy of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is our reference guide in psychiatry. It basically describes every single psychological condition, psychiatric condition, and the criteria that we use to make that diagnosis. Now, some people joke and they say the only real benefit of the DSM is for insurance companies, because, and they have a point, because the insurance companies won't pay for a condition unless you have a clinical condition. So the one thing, why I bring this up now, is that the one common thread in all those conditions, mostly, is functioning. So when someone's emotional conditions start impairing in their functioning, that's when it becomes a clinical condition. And so that very much will happen when you talk about effects of climate change. So I'm going to split it up to direct and indirect. This distinction is a little bit maybe not so important because there's a lot of overlap. But there are direct effects of the climate. Rick talked about this a little bit too. First of all, heat. There is some early studies. The literature in this field is kind of on the new side, so we need more of it. But there are studies that show a direct link with temperature and mental health, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. Also, there is, I mentioned this slide, I want to talk about Helene a lot, because when I saw the footage from Asheville, it was fairly horrifying to see. I don't think there was a river before, but these rivers and homes going down the rivers and people clinging on to a piece of furniture going down the river. Someone going through that is a direct threat to their survival, and that is a direct effect on their mental health. So trauma secondary to firsthand experience of life-threatening conditions. So another common area is wildfires. Up in California, there's a lot of wildfires that are felt to be due to the weather. Chronic stress from environmental degradation, loss of home, food, water, resources, those kind of bleed a little bit into indirect effects, so I'll talk about that later. But of course, if you lose a family member or loved one as a result, like in North Carolina, they said that people would, 1 second were on the roof, the next second were off, and then they never found them. That's a trauma that can be hard to ever get over. And so those are direct effects. Indirect, the economic outcome of the climate. Loss of jobs. In this area, we'll hear all kinds of stories in this category. For example, someone worked for a restaurant, the restaurant's shut down for a month. They lost their job. Climate migration, people leaving because of the weather, loss of access to food, resources. And one thing I'm going to probably come back to is just the impact on vulnerable communities. It does seem, in my experience, that economically, if people have more resources, they can kind of get through some of this a little bit better off than those who don't. The ones who are lower SES status, they're already kind of on the edge, and these type of events push them over. So clinical conditions affected by climate change. So I don't want to make this boring. I'll just kind of touch upon some things, and we'll go into it a little bit more detail. So first of all, the post-traumatic stress is what we all think about. Again, the person in the wildfire, the person in the flood, they basically, one of the criteria is that they are in a situation where they think that their life is at jeopardy. You can get acute stress, which is immediately you start having anxiety, your body basically, your brain and body tries to protect yourself from it, and also trying to cope with it, you re-experience this over and over again. Nightmares, flashbacks, you try to avoid thinking about it, but it kind of pops itself in your head. A lot of anxiety, tension, physical effects. So it's a very common sequelae, but actually, even if you're not at risk of harm, and just the whole act of living through a hurricane, as a lot of us can attest to, it can cause an increase in general anxiety. So that feeling, as those maybe from outside aren't aware, you don't get a lot of warning before these hurricanes, but in those days when the warning comes, there's this environmental panic, like in all the stores, and people are buying everything, and then people are talking about at work, the airports are closing. That kind of increase in anxiety can last then for people, even if they don't have PTSD or post-traumatic stress. I'm going to talk about this psychosis in a little bit when I talk about some cases, but anxiety can lead to dysregulated mood, which is more anger, outbursts, aggression. Depression obviously can happen with all of these things, and increased suicide rates. So I want to talk a little bit about this. This is a study in US and Mexico. Essentially, they looked at climate month to month. And what they found was for every 1 degree Celsius increase in the temperature, the ambient temperature, there was a rise in suicide rate of 0.7% in the US and 2.1% in Mexico. Now, when they broke it down, they showed different areas where they had more of an increase. They say in this study that there was no relation to, for example, if you live in a place that's already hotter, or if you have air conditioning, that there was an effect of economic factors. But I think this is really early on, and I think it's kind of a little bit muddy still to make that statement. More studies are needed in that regard. Other thing I just wanted to touch upon, this is a study out of Australia. So on your left side, on the top, I don't know if I have a pointer, but the top left is an indicator of the population density. And then next to it is the amount of violent crime. If you can see in like at 3 o'clock, there's a little red dot. That's like the most concentrated area population. And if you go next door, that's where there's a lot of violent crime. And the graph on the lower left is the temperature, which kind of shows that it's not that little center area that is the hottest. But over on the right side, the same maps, this is talking about vegetation. So the top left is grass cover, right next to it is shrub cover, lower left is tree cover. So what they looked at is this is something called urban heat islands, which is a phenomenon where a city is significantly warmer or hotter than the surrounding rural areas because there's a lot of hard surfaces, concrete, asphalt, and they absorbs the heat and then reflects it back. So what they saw was that in that little pocket, you can see it's light green, so there's not a whole lot of vegetation in that area. And they found an association. The more vegetation, the less violent crime outside. So not violent crime inside, but outside there was more violent crime in the areas where they did not have this green cover. It kind of, to me, makes sense. It feels like you get, here in Florida, we know this, right? If you see a tree, we run for it and give shade. But it's the beginnings of studies showing these links between mood and environment. So I'm going to just switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the clinical experience. I've been living in Sarasota for almost 9 years and went through 3 hurricanes in that time, Irma, Ian, and Milton. Irma and Milton, I worked in the hospitals at that time. So I want to give some case studies. I thought that might be more interesting than just a lot of statistics. So this is a picture from Ian. So this is Northport. And as we know for Ian, the South counties got hit really hard. And one of our mental health technicians' name was Clara Glass. She gave me permission to use this slide. She is on that ATV with her son behind her. So she told me the story. Their neighborhood, her mother's neighborhood, the roads are completely flooded. So her father had a tractor, put all of his important documents, papers into the bucket of the tractor and felt he could make it out because the house was flooding. And he ended up, the water stopped the tractor. So she got on her ATV and with her son and went out there, and they were basically in the water picking up whatever they could find. So she sent it to all of us at work, and it's kind of an example of what happened. This is from the Sarasota Herald Tribune, which similar kind of picture, people kayaking down the streets. So Hurricane Ian hit further south. It actually damaged many of the hospitals south of us. So Venice, the Venice branch of Sarasota Memorial, which at the time was pretty new, it got filled with all of people coming up from south. And then we would see consults of those patients. I wanted to talk about a couple of them. So both of these patients I saw in consultations, and they came from the South County. Names have been changed. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll say the first one is Eleanor, a woman in her late 70s. She lived alone with her cat, and she was preparing for the hurricane. And she told me that she was just going around the house, making sure she had her flashlights and all that. And the cat got spooked. They have a term for this. It's apparently called zoomies, where the cats run around like when they pick up that there's something going on. So the cat got spooked and started running around, tripped her up as she was turning off a light. She tripped and fell, and she ended up suffering 2 fractures in her hip. So she landed kind of wedged between the sofa and the wall, and she couldn't move. And she couldn't move for hours and in pain from this fracture because she couldn't move. Her phone was somewhere else. She couldn't even call for help. And then the hurricane hit. So the whole time of the hurricane, she was sitting there. And what happened is when the hurricane ended, I can't remember the exact number of hours, but I want to say like 6 hours that she was sitting in that spot. And then finally, the next day, she said the National Guard were going through the neighborhood. And one of the neighbors said, well, we haven't seen her. So they came in and they basically took her in, and she ended up getting transferred, airlifted to Sarasota Memorial. She had her surgery. She was going to go to rehab. And, you know, when I talked to her, she had anxiety. She had panic, obviously. But she didn't have the makings of PTSD. Now, PTSD comes a little bit later. It doesn't come immediately after a trauma. But she actually had some resilience in this whole experience because she felt very saved by the National Guard. She talked about the relief she had when they came in. And so she had a very good outlook. She felt like, hey, look, I've come through this. And people were calling as I was talking to her. She was getting calls from family in other parts of the country. The other story is Carlos, who was a gentleman I saw on a Baker Act. If you don't know, Baker Act is an involuntary admission to a psychiatric facility when someone is concerned for someone's safety. So Carlos was in a shelter and had made a suicide attempt after the hurricane. So what had happened is that he lived in his car. And he went into the shelter when there was a mandatory evacuation. But when he came out, the car was destroyed. It was, you know, completely flooded. He had no insurance. And he said he used to drive to the restaurant where he worked and just work. And now he was without a home, essentially. So he made a suicide attempt and was found by police and brought into the hospital. So we kept him on the Baker Act, and he got sent. And the social services were trying to find a family member or someone, you know, who could help him. Because essentially one of the problems is that the shelters get filled. And, you know, actually we don't have that many shelters to begin with. And with COVID, they kind of got overburdened themselves. And so that's the socioeconomic, the indirect effects, is that the resources for people who lose their homes are not that great to begin with and dwindling. But these are a couple of the cases. Now, this is Hurricane Milton. So Hurricane Milton just happened, as we know. This is from Wellington, Florida, but we know that it made landfall in Siesta Keys. So I'm going to talk about this case, and this is the case Paris, I changed the name, one of my patients I saw immediately after the hurricane. A 15-year-old girl who basically the story was that she and her younger sister were removed from their mother's home when she was probably about, you know, early on, like 4 years old, and for domestic violence. She was put into foster care and adopted out of foster care by a family. However, she lived in that family for about 7 years, and unfortunately, the adopted father was molesting both her and her younger sister. So at some point, she did report it, was removed from the home and put into the foster care system, was living in group homes, and, you know, kind of moving from group home to group home, a lot of admissions, in psychiatric hospitals for behavioral disturbances, you know, suicidal ideation, aggression, and culminating in about 6 months in a residential treatment program here in Sarasota, or in Manatee County, actually. In the meantime, her mother was working the plan to get them back. So all of this was happening in 2024. She got out of the residential. Mom was working to get her back, and her sister. And mom told me when she came out of the residential, she was on a lot of medications. She was a little bit too sedated. There was more admissions while she was getting weaned off of medicines, but having anxiety, having some troubles, and had never dealt with the trauma of the molestation. So mom said, let's get you, let's work on this. There's and I don't know enough about this clinic, but there's a clinic working with kids who experience this abuse. But mother told me that, in order to go there, you have to have a police report of the trauma. And she didn't have it. Back when this was reported, they just removed her from that family's home and put her in foster care, but there was never any police report. So mom said, I didn't want to do this, but I had to do this to get her the help, because mom was still struggling financially, and said, let's try to do this. She basically had to make a police report. So now we're at the end of the summer, and Paris had to go to the police and go into detail about what had happened, file a police report, and that would let her get into this clinic. And they assured mom, we'll get her in quickly and we can start working on the trauma. So that all happened. She gave the police report. She's feeling more agitated. And then Hurricane Milton hit. So they were living in Zone C, which normally doesn't get evacuated, but in this case was. It was mandatory evacuation. So what mom told me was that whole act of being removed from your home again, even though mom was with her and they were going to a shelter, it started triggering Paris, and she started getting more agitated because, she had been removed when she was young, and that's led to everything that happened. But they made it through the hurricane, and they're coming back. They go to the clinic. Well, the clinic is shut down, and this happened. This is what we talk about resources. A lot of places were shut down because the power was out. Sometimes the power was out for weeks, or maybe the building was damaged, or staff members had to evacuate, and they couldn't come back. We had that same problem with our Department of Psychiatry. Some people went to Brandon and a bridge was washed out and they couldn't come back. And so then the people who are left behind, myself included, end up working and working more because you don't have relief coming in. So in her case, she couldn't get into the clinic. She couldn't get the therapy to work on the trauma that had just been resurrected because she had to file this police report and then got evacuated from her home. So she ended up reporting increased suicidal thoughts. She was very agitated, and she got admitted to our hospital. Now, the good news is that we put back some of the medicines that she did need, but she was not sedated. Mom said another factor, the girl had had insurance when she was in foster care that ended when she was with mom, and mom yet couldn't get her on her insurance, so she actually had no insurance. So this is a nice thing that we have at Sarasota Memorial, is that they have a patient assistance office, and they can get these families on Medicaid, and they retroactively cover the admissions. So we reassured mom, don't worry about that, we'll take care of that, we'll get her back into services. And I remember one day she was blowing up on the units, obscenities, swearing about the tech who had told her just to lower her voice. And when we started on medication, she actually came, she goes, I'm feeling a lot better, I'm calmer now. That was just me getting sensitive, So she did do better while she was with us. And when she went home, we were getting her referred to services, and mom would get her on Medicaid too. So that was a good outcome, and she was doing better. But I wanted to just mention, to highlight the ways that you don't think about how hurricanes can affect someone's well-being. It's very, it's ingrained in our society. All these different things happen, The clinic couldn't be there for this girl because they themselves were going through the trauma. So for Hurricane Milton, I was working during the hurricane. My kids and I slept on the floor of my office for 2 nights, and I saw the patients in the hospital. This, if you don't know, is Cornell Behavioral Health Pavilion, which is a brand new inpatient psych facility with Sarasota Memorial Hospital. And there was about 38 patients in the hospital. I saw them each day. And I asked each of them, I was very curious, how are you feeling? How are you doing? I was prepared to give them whatever they needed to help them go through the storm. But with the exception of 2 patients who have a primary psychotic illness, those 2 patients were not doing well. They couldn't understand why. They were just more agitated. We had to give them extra medications. And that's kind of what happens. It's an environmental stressor, and it's anxiety that can destabilize a psychosis. But for the rest of the patients, they all pretty universally told me that they were doing okay. And the phrase that I heard over and over was, I feel safe here. Now, if you've seen this building, you can understand. It looks like a hotel. It's beautiful. It's newly built, hurricane-grade windows. There was no shutters on the thing. It felt sturdy. You didn't even sense the storm. Actually, when it was hitting, I was with the director, Terry Cassidy, and we were walking around just watching the stuff flying around outside. And when I came back, my one daughter looked up and said, "So this hurricane, is it coming?" So, because you really didn't sense it in that kind of a sturdy building, but it kind of tells you then what the experience is like, on the other hand, for people maybe not in such a sturdy building. Now, for Ian, we were at home, and I can say the difference psychologically, we had shutters up. You don't know what's going on outside because all you see are these aluminum shutters. One of the shutters got blown off from the wind and started banging against our window and breaking the window. The shutter did. But all you hear is this kind of wind whistling, a banging sound. It's way more anxiety provoking. And to Rick's point, knowledge is key. So if you can look and see, hey, it's not that bad. It's not like cows are flying by or whatnot, it can be reassuring. So people in the hospital were generally fine. They were fine. We stayed there from Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and Thursday. We ended up, it was called that curfews were over and the B team was going to come in. And when we're packing up, the same daughter said, "Well, I don't know. I still think Turkey was a better vacation." And so I'm kind of thinking okay, what is it about how we raise our kids that they thought this was a vacation? But, anyway, I come back to that slide of Clara. So her friends sent this as a meme and it went viral. It said, "Reminder that in almost any emergency situation, but especially natural disasters, one redneck friend or neighbor is worth 1,000 PhDs." So I don't mean to offend any PhDs in the audience, but I consider myself in that category, and I would agree with this statement. And I heard something similar in the footage from Helene, where someone in Appalachia was saying, they were up in these mountains. There's not even real roads in some areas, and there was a lot of controversy about FEMA, but it was hard for any kind of vehicles to get up there. And a gentleman up there said, people here get a lot of grief, but these are the ones you want on your side in these kind of situations. And it's a good point because there is this one thing that happens after the hurricanes, which is I've noticed myself. There's a coming together afterwards and people helping each other, and it can maybe silver lining. I wish there was some way to make it last longer. But anyway, so I thank you for your time. I hope this was informative.